Was it a successful meeting, more successful than you're expecting, as successful as it could be, less successful in any way? Let's get your broad views on that, and we'll have a more detailed conversation after that. Why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. Well, let me just say, yesterday I was watching the press briefing on CNN when Biden did his press briefings, and I noticed, one of the commentators quite over the top describing the significance of the meeting, saying, it was a significant reset in U.S.-China relations. Now, Robert Daley was a commentator on CNN. I saw him too, but it wasn't Robert Daley that said that. Look, I think this was a good meeting between the two presidents, and I think it comes at an important time, but I think we have to be more realistic about what it means for the relationship. For example, does it mean the two countries are, is it a reset, major reset, significant reset, and the two countries are now ushering in a new era of, golden and bright relations? Of course not. The long-term trend lines still point to intensifying strategic competition and rivalry. But the successful meeting, and I think it was successful, will help put the relationship on more solid footing as we approach the year 2024, which will be a very challenging year with elections in Taiwan and the United States. And it will be difficult for Biden to be forward-leaning on China in the year 2024, as he'll need to be seen as being tough on China, as we saw at the end of the press conference when answering a question, he said, yes, he still believes that Xi is a dictator. Foreshadowing, I think, of what is to expect, what we should expect in 2024. Second, I would just say there's also some positive agreements that came out of the meeting on mill-to-mill, fentanyl, AI in the military, although it's not quite clear what was agreed to there. People-to-people, raising the number of flights, things like that. These are good, but of course the key to all of these will be in the follow-up actions, and we'll need to see how the agreements are carried out before I think we can judge really how meaningful they are. As Biden said in the press conference, trust but verify. So I think in sum, I would say the meeting showed both sides have been willing to make some tactical shifts in their approach, but it didn't bring any fundamental strategic shifts.
Great, Paul. Very helpful to lay the landscape. And just to kind of dissect a few things you said, in saying that it was successful, it seemed as if you were mainly pointing to the mill-to-mill agreement and the agreement about fentanyl. I want to just ask you before I ask others, is there some other thing about the meeting that made you think it was successful? And maybe in my own mind, I'm thinking of just the general optics. The general optics seemed friendly, and, it just had the overall demeanor of the two presidents seemed positive. And I thought going into the meeting, this is something that certainly the Chinese side really wanted. And so I wonder if that's part of your analysis of why this meeting was, in your view, successful.
Yeah, I think both leaders wanted the meeting to be successful, but each for their own reasons. Xi Jinping, of course, I think a big part of it, of course, was, the struggling economy and the challenges that he has there. And, wanting to put forward a more positive image of China in that context. And I think he had the opportunity to do that. And I think they probably feel that they did as good a job as they could on their side. I think President Biden, we have seen in the lead up to the meeting, a number of steps that he has taken to reopen high level channels of communication, which he thinks is important. The administration is not going to back off on the competitive aspects of the relationship or pushing back where Chinese policies are undermining U.S. interest. But the Biden administration does want to balance that out with, they say with intense competition, you need intense diplomacy and dialogue and cooperation. And I think so, they're able to flesh out a bit more the framework they're proposing to the Chinese side. And the Chinese side thinks it's all about competition and confrontation. And the Biden administration is saying, no, we think dialogue, diplomacy and cooperation are important too. And we saw more elements of that in this engagement.
Great, Paul. Yahweh, let me come to you next. How does Paul's answer sound to you? Is that consistent with your views? And especially the last part of Paul's answer, speaking about the Chinese side's perspective, does that ring true to you as well?
Yeah, I largely agree with Paul's analysis. I think she feels this is a good success because he's able to present a kinder and gentler image, and particularly his speech to the business leaders and old friends. Last night, it was a charm offensive. I think Biden is also done a good job. Basically, he get what he really wants. That is to prevent more young Americans to die from fentanyl. I think both leaders probably would think this is a right moment. because they are able to project their image of in control. They're not going to allow this rivalry to veer into conflict. And but again, I think if you look at what is coming out of the Chinese media and what Biden says at that press conference that Paul mentioned, there is a very divergent view in terms of how significant this meeting is. You listen to President Biden, it's all the concrete things, and then you read the Chinese readout, and you read Xi's speech, or you listen to the speech, you think this is all about big things. I think what's more important for this relationship is not the big things, but the small things, the concrete actions that Paul mentioned.
Yahweh, you alluded to both Xi Jinping's speech and this meeting with business leaders. I think that's a component of the last day and a half that I definitely want us to talk about. And let's just be very clear about what that is. That was a gala dinner that was, I believe, organized by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. There were a lot of very fancy business leaders there, and Xi Jinping gave this speech, which I read in Anna Swanson's report. Steve Orland said that there were 3 potential speeches that Xi Jinping could give, and he gave the friendliest one. At the same time, that meeting has generated a lot of debate within the sort of American political discourse and a lot of criticism of the business leaders for being there. So I do want to put a pin in that we're going to talk about that, and maybe even see if Yahweh, if you want to say a word or two about the way in which that dinner was maybe reported on in the U.S. political context.
I think 2 takeaways from that speech is, number one, of course, he wants to cultivate this relationship with the American business community. This is the group that can really anchor the relationship, has been the anchor, but that anchor seems to be shaking. And so it's very important to convince them that China is still a good country, friendly country. They're all welcome to do business. I think the other deliverable of that speech is, the old friends. China will never forget the old friends. He referred to his first visit. I think Biden has done a good job showing on his phone Xi's picture with the background of the Golden Gate Bridge. I think all these small things. People like, particularly in China, like to talk about big things. I look at these small things, the walk, showing the picture, and President Biden commenting on the Wuhan, China-made Hongqi limousine, and I think the warmth was able to project at last night's speech is huge.
Yahweh, do you want to say anything about the controversy about the dinner in American political discourse? Do you think it matters at all to the Chinese that the House Select Committee is tweeting about the guest list and suggesting that they're all somehow tainted for going to that dinner?
Well, I think Congressman Gallagher can do whatever he likes to do, and I don't think these business leaders are going to be intimidated. The bottom line, of course, is to reward their shareholders, and China still remains the market, and of course, as these corporations make money, it generates more jobs, and I don't think business leaders are going to be that much concerned, and particularly as big as they are. I don't think a hearing is really going to scare them off. That's my personal opinion.
Great. Why don't we go to Robert Daly next? And Robert, again, the broad question now is your 30,000-foot impression of the meeting between Biden and Xi. Maybe also what you think of that dinner that we've been talking about, and anything you want to respond to that Paul and Yahweh have said.
Sure. Well, I agree with Paul. My overall assessment is that this is a small, constructive step that we should welcome. I think the more meetings that they have, the better. And so that is all to the good. But it's again, a very small step. And I think that it's not one that is going to change the course of this relationship. I think the trajectory is still extremely negative and that we haven't found bottom yet. But far better to be talking in the way they are. I was struck, I was listening to Yahweh, I was reminded, as I watch these things, it's hard sometimes to suppress cynicism. Those of us who've been watching this stuff for many decades are very familiar with all of the theatrical, performative aspects of this. And by definition, almost everything that we see is part of the performative business here. I am not at all moved by Xi invoking his time in Iowa and his old friends. I think that this is mostly a shtick that he wields pretty transparently for what he thinks is an easy win. And maybe it is with many people. It's not an easy win with me. I don't buy it. I don't buy that that he and Biden are old good friends. I don't really see how that could be possible. They don't speak the same language. They don't come from the same political culture. And again, I'm very sorry to feel the cynicism welling up in me, but I said, yeah, flying tigers, yeah. I mean, our heartstrings actually that easy to pluck? The invocation of pandas, yes, cute. Chipmunks are cute. Lots of mammals are cute. Again, this is the old cynic in me that keeps on watching this stuff and wanting to kick back against the easy wins that people are obviously seeking. Xi's speech, while the tenor of it was friendlier, it was really also just a stringing together of things that he said many, many times. And often he has said some of these things, and they've been followed in other speeches by now equally clichéic negative attacks. And so, again, if you've been paying close attention, you can hear the silent xiaohoyu, the attack that often comes with these things. And so I felt that throughout, the performative aspect, which is important. And again, it was a constructive move. On the dinner,
Robert, just before you talk about the dinner, I can't resist asking, because Steve Orleans has this quote that says there are 3 different versions of the speech, and this was the friendliest.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what would have been in the other 2 speeches? Like, if you think there's some shades in this, like, can you imagine that there would be like another version of the speech that would be less friendly?
Oh, well, but we've all heard that speech. He's given those speeches. We know what those would be like, and they would be there would have been a lot more in there about, for example, hegemony, the inherent hegemony of the United States. There would have been more warnings about the danger of seeing China as a threat. There are various shades that he's run through on all of this. On the controversy about the dinner, this is something that the National Committee and the U.S.-China Business Council do almost all the time. It's part of the reason that they exist, is that somebody needs to do these welcoming dinners. The Asia Society was involved, I think the Council on Foreign Relations. So this is really business as usual. But 2 thoughts about it. One is, should it be? I read Gallagher's letter, and I was frankly, and Paul and I talked about this a little bit in a different venue, I was sort of appalled by the inherent threat in that, the asking, to hand over the guest lists. I can't think of any reason under law that would validate that. It seems like a straight out intimidation tactic for activities that are not at all illegal. Gallagher's argument in the letter is that these activities are untoward. They are in bad taste. They are perhaps immoral. All those things are subjective matters of opinion, and Congress shouldn't be able to ask for a guest list just on that basis. So my primary response to the critique was that I thought that it was a misuse of the legislative powers. At the same time, I think there is a question that all of us have to think about, because most of the people on this call are, to some degree, still really committed to engagement with China. They think it's important for the relationship. I certainly do. And many of us care about China, have lived there, and would like to go back again, all of which is positive. At the same time, I think you have to ask yourself, at what point don't you fet a visiting leader? How much is too much? There are certainly leaders around the world whose banquets all of us would not attend. So the question of what is the line? Why is it okay to go? Is it just because of money? Is it for the sake of the stability of the relationship? I think that the direction of the relationship demands that we all be pretty clear about that, and clear on where our individual lines are. So I think that the questions that Gallagher was raising in his letter are actually important questions for the United States as a country, and for all of us individually, for corporations individually, to ask. And there can be different answers to those questions, but the question should be asked. It's the threat that comes with the questions that offends me.
Very, very interesting, Robert. I see Anna's on stage, so I want to go to Anna next, and Anna, you can maybe just say hi to everyone, introduce yourself. But especially the fact that you did spend a lot of your prior career at the U.S.-China Business Council, I want you to weigh in on this question that Robert is teeing up of whether, apart from whether or not it's appropriate to kind of like threaten people about the dinner, whether or not we should be having dinners like that for a leader like President Xi Jinping, and then more broadly, what did you think of the meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi generally?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I am in the airport in Abu Dhabi on my way back from Shanghai, taking the long way around, and just had a power nap. So hopefully my thoughts are coherent. So anyway, yes, Anna Ashton. I'm a director on the China team at Eurasia Group, a geopolitical risk consulting firm, and I did work for several years, 6 years at the U.S.-China Business Council, as well as for several years at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which also was a partner in putting together this dinner, although they're not taking as much heat because they weren't one of the main partners. I don't know. I think Gallagher is acting as an ideological purist, probably because he thinks that that's his job. His role as the chair of the China Selects Committee means that he doesn't have the power to introduce legislation. The committee doesn't have the power to introduce legislation. It is there to talk about China. And it's pretty evident that what he and many others on the committee see as the conversation that needs to be had is one of holding China to account for being, different from the United States, having a very different system, and having leaders who, appear to have some pretty fundamentally different values on certain issues. That's okay. It's okay for him to interpret his job that way and for him to pursue it that way. But, I would just say that business leaders don't have that job. Their job is not to be talk shops or bullhorns. Their job is to make sure that their business is thriving. And as you said, the Business Council and other trade associations that represent the business community, their job is to facilitate businesses' needs. And then, Biden and Xi also have yet again different jobs. Their jobs are to look after the economic and national security needs of their countries. And both of them clearly decided that those top priorities were best facilitated by having this meeting. Asking whose banquet would business leaders not attend? Business leaders would not attend a pretty short list of banquets for sure. They wouldn't attend a Putin banquet. They wouldn't attend a Kim banquet. They wouldn't attend a banquet for any country that has been, isolated from the United States in its diplomatic relations, that has been, sanctioned across the board. And they wouldn't because the government has drawn a really clear line for relations with those countries. They can't do business with those countries. And if the government wants to draw that line with China, which it seems Gallagher wants to do, that's the government's job. It is not the business leader's job to make the determination about who the United States is going to do business with. And the reason that I would say Congress and the US government haven't yet drawn a stark line like that is because it's crazy. It would be terrible for the US economy. It would be terrible for the Chinese economy. Something terrible for the Chinese economy all by itself would be terrible for the US economy. That's not looking after the best interests of the American people. It's uncomfortable, but that means that there is moral ambiguity here and that there are, amoral relationships that have to happen. But the United States does that with countries all the time. That's the job of diplomacy.
Anna, let me pose something to you that I've been cooking up in my own mind today, which is that, there's a lot of reporting on the way in which Chinese state media has pivoted in the last few days to much more positive reporting about the U.S. in the lead up to this meeting. And so when commentators note that, and they were talking about this even on CNN last night before the Biden press conference, the commentators note that, they would say something like, it's like ironic or, odd that the Chinese state media switched so quickly. And so a lot of Chinese people are kind of confused about how the rhetoric about the U.S. has turned on a dime. Obviously, implicitly, there's a criticism there of the way that the Chinese rhetoric has been about the U.S. And it's been, I think, apparent to me over the course of the last day that a similar issue here in the U.S., where, you were saying there's some people you can't have dinner with. You can't have dinner with Putin. You can't have dinner with Kim Jong-un. But I think that, at least in my view, we have been discussing Xi Jinping, perhaps fairly, perhaps not, as a similar kind of figure as those figures. And so, I think our political discourse has had trouble kind of changing with the new signals coming from the top that we are going to have, a friendlier dynamic with this particular person than we do with Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. So I think in a lot of ways, the disconnect that we're talking about in the Chinese context is also true here in the U.S. context. What do you think of that?
Well, I do think that in both contexts, there are media environments that are not just purely objective, but they're not objective for just different reasons. Obviously, we don't have a media that can be directed at the drop of a hat to change its tone across the board on issues, the way that it seems that the Chinese media did on, how friendly the government feels towards America and how friendly Chinese people should be towards Americans. But we do have a media that is, divided into groups that cater to their own audiences. Different segments of the US population watch different parts of those, and they don't get an across the whole range perspective because they're not watching across the whole range. They're watching what they want to hear. They're stuck in their own echo chambers. In some ways, the problem there is that how do you change the narrative if the narrative needs to be, injected with some other thinking, some other perspectives? Can you change the narrative, or are you so beholden to your audience's pre-existing biases, and sometimes the biases that you've created for them, that you just have to continue with the script regardless of whether or not that's true, or whether it serves good purposes. So yeah, I think there are similarities. They come from different places. And I guess your other question was, why is the media lumping Xi in with these other figures?
I mean, you did sort of answer my question. If you want, you could say something about that. But, I think the main question here is, did you see some kind of commonality? And I think you had a very interesting response to that. Do you want to say more about that, or should we go to Zoe?
No, I'll pause there. Let's go to Zoe.
Great. So Zoe, let's bring you in. And Zoe, I want to ask you to kind of get us back to discussing the Biden-Xi meeting in particular. And again, what's your overall impression of how the meeting went? But since you look at the economic relationship, something I want to tee up for you is the stuff that didn't happen at the meeting that both sides ideally would want. So, I'll put a few things on the table and maybe you'll have more. It seems clear that the Chinese side and Xi Jinping in particular would like us to stop putting, these export restrictions on technology. And on the U.S. side, we want the Chinese to stop intimidating foreign businesses in China. And as far as I can tell, there was nothing in the meeting on either of those points. So how much does that matter in terms of how we think about the success or failure of this meeting? And are those things that both sides are going to keep trying for but not make traction on? Or is there some way in which those types of issues can improve over time as well?
Yeah, and I do think before the Biden-Xi meeting happened, we had at the CFR we had a press brief, and my boss Mike Froman asked me what would be my bar of success, and I said, my response was, if we were able to restore military-to-military communication channels, I view that as a success. But the reason I did not, even think about making progress on economic issues is perhaps because the securitization of a lot of these economic and financial issues. And you are right, a lot the tariff is not. While President Xi Jinping really would hope for the expiration of tariffs, it did not happen. And actually, that's probably not something that could possibly happen now or next year, knowing that we are going to have an election, right? And then on the other hand, we still have export controls, and then we also have more stringent inbound investment screening. And on top of that, recently there is this executive order of outbound investment screening. So a lot of these economic issues in other words, the policy priorities that Chinese policymakers as well as President Xi Jinping may want, they really didn't happen. And then in terms of, if I zoom out to look at the overall U.S.-China, the summit, I do agree with Paul, Robert, and Yahweh in that I do think this is a positive step forward, but it really does not solve the fundamental structural challenges. However, I do think this time perhaps the United States, a dynamic change it has happened in the economic front, which is coming. Even if we just compare with a year ago when President Xi Jinping and Biden met in Bali, at that time, the Chinese economy were still among the very few major economies that was recording positive growth rate, and at that time the Chinese export was record high. And the expectation of the Chinese economic growth trajectory when they met in Bali was that the Chinese economy is going to would snap back as soon as China or President Xi Jinping exited zero COVID. Whereas the sentiment for the U.S. economy at that time was pretty doomish, as if market predicted that the U.S. economy is going to head towards a recession. But none of those happened. Here in the United States, Q3 our growth number is 4.9%, and our job number is very good, and we are even doing better fingers crossed, to tame inflation, whereas the Chinese economy is sort of like borderline deflationary. So from that perspective, I do think the economic dynamic has changed. Therefore, perhaps it is in U.S. policymaking's interest to rethink our premise of the China policy, and perhaps that's also a contributing factor to the relatively friendly environment. In that, on the one hand, President Xi Jinping realized that he really need the summit to go well, at least trying to restore confidence in the Chinese economy. And then on the other hand, for President Biden politically, he really doesn't really need this to go perfect because of the elections and all that. And then economically, America's economy is simply becoming much stronger. So I guess I'll just stop there, saying that I agree with my colleagues here. And then I just economic wise, a lot of the securitization of economic issues make it difficult to make any significant or concrete breakthroughs at this moment.
So Zoe, let me just ask a follow-up of you as well, which is that, the conventional wisdom that I think a lot of commentators have been saying for the last few days is that the Chinese economy is doing really badly, and Xi Jinping is feeling that pressure in a very deep way, and so that has a lot to do with the kind of friendlier attitude. And it sounds like you are broadly confirming that, but I just want to kind of push it a little further and see if you think there's any weakness to that analysis. Like, is Xi Jinping, does he care that much about the way that the Chinese economy looks at this particular moment? And is that really, because there could be a lot of other things he might do domestically as well if he really thought the Chinese economy was in bad shape, which he's not doing. He's not doing a big stimulus. He's not doing a lot of the kinds of things that you might do if you thought the economy was. He's not lessening the pressure on foreign business. So, how much is that really the explanation for it, whatever we might perceive as a friendlier attitude going into the summit?
I do think that the economic momentum is an important factor, but I also do think that foreign confidence, in particular U.S. confidence in the U.S. business confidence in the Chinese economy, is particularly important. Part of the reason is because right now, President Xi Jinping, he has a lot of ambitions, but he is also facing a more stringent or steeper budget constraint. If it's 10 years ago, he wanted to do a lot of the ambitious agenda that he's having now. If it's 10 years ago, when the economy grows faster, he has more capacity to do that. But the Chinese economy suffered a lot during COVID. Local governments has many of them are not only in deficit, but their revenue stream from the land use right sales to the property developers who are also drying out. And so, in other words, although the central government does have a lot of physical capacity, the room for maneuver at the local level becomes more stringent. I do not think he doesn't care about the economy. I do think he cares about it, and part of the reason is because if he does, if we follow the line of any book about dictatorship or the dictator's rule playbook, the first thing is you wanted to have a country that you can rule, you can dictate over. Then that basically means you need to have a robust economy, or at least an economy that is not necessarily shrinking or tanking. So from that perspective, I really do think he cares about the economy, but domestically, he really does not have a lot of capacity to do it. Part of the reason is also because it is very difficult to inject confidence, both at household level as well as at corporate level. Now, to what extent the business dinner can restore the confidence, I do not know.
And maybe just to add, Zoe, if it really is the case that he thinks that there's a problem with business confidence in China, and all these business leaders are telling him, well, in that case, you need to stop, harassing foreign businessmen in China, you would think that you would make some progress on that. But have you seen any progress on that issue?
Well, unfortunately, perhaps he did something, but I haven't seen anything concrete. We still read stories about, well, not necessarily recently around APEC, but before APEC, running up to APEC, we still read stories about people, in terms of exit ban, and then on top of that, we also see domestic property market shake up. The biggest developers now are state-owned, and Poly Group, the Poly Property Development Group associated with the Poly Group, which is a large weapon maker, now is number one property developers in China. So I think there are a lot of mismatches between what he say or the image he tries to project, at least here in San Francisco, versus the actual agenda he wanted to achieve.
Great. So let me come back to Paul. Paul, you've heard a lot added after your initial intervention, and you might have some responses to that. But I also want to move the conversation a step forward and see what you think the next period is going to look like after this meeting. Are there going to be things to keep an eye out for? Are there things that in the background of this apparently friendly looking meeting we might see immediate kind of metrics on that we can judge that the relationship is generally stabilizing in various ways?
Well, thanks, Nathan. I've really appreciated the comments of the previous speakers. And I'll just say one thing on all of that before we move on to sort of the next period. I think what was most interesting to me are these comments. Yahweh said that China seems to be moving to a charm offensive. Everyone's kind of agreed that some interesting shifts are taking place. Is it because of the struggling economy? Are there more reasons why China seems to be shifting? It's not just the U.S. Apparently, there are discussions between Chinese and Lithuania about normalizing their relationship, after, they pulled ambassadors out of each country. Australia Prime Minister visited China. That relationship is on better footing now, where China dropped, some of the bans that had put up. And Australia didn't really make concessions to get there, apparently. So, and if you look at the U.S., right, I mean, the Chinese up until this point have been saying we fundamentally disagree with the U.S. approach now, this idea of strategic competition, confrontation, pushing back on China, yet still being able to cooperate and have dialogue. And the Chinese have been saying, if you're going to take this hostile approach to us in terms of competition and confrontation, we're not going to be able to find ways to cooperate, even in areas where there are sort of transnational issues or global issues. And, we're not going to engage in robust dialogue. They clearly, have shifted here. And in the lead up, as I said before, to the two leaders' meetings, there's been a lot of dialogue at the cabinet secretary level with cabinet secretary visits to China. The Chinese foreign minister went, the vice premier went. That was, of course, to lay the groundwork for Xi. The working groups, of course, have been, reestablished in many cases. And now we have this engagement at the presidential level. So the Chinese have shifted here, and they've, even with the U.S. side has not backed off, for example, on export controls, as you said. They have not backed off, and they've been very clear on sanctions, Chinese companies on the entities list, all those things. They're very clear they're not planning to do that, yet China has shifted. There are also some areas of cooperation on fentanyl that they've announced, mill-to-mill reopening. And these things have taken place without a change in fundamental approach on the U.S. side. Is it because of the Chinese economy? I think it's a little bit. I mean, I think it's partly to do with that. But I think the Chinese president is probably feeling much more pressure than just the economy. I was at a conference here in Singapore recently, and I was talking to a Chinese observer who said, the big question is, what progress has Xi made for the country, in the last few years? What has he done that's been beneficial? You've got the COVID story. You've got the economy, which we talked about, the geopolitical situation for China. China is under much more pressure. There's a lot of frustration in China about the decision to strategically align with Russia as far as they have. The wolf warrior rhetoric, there's a lot of debate and discussion about that. Am I suggesting that she's at risk of losing power? No, I'm not. But I'm just suggesting that there will be big questions being asked. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Those that have traveled to China have heard people grumbling about the current situation. So I think there is a lot of pressure there. And I think that partly explains why we're seeing some tactical shifts. In terms of what the next period, going forward, I still think that this progress that has been made, the success of this meeting, is still precarious. We remember Biden and Xi met in November of last year at Bali, and everyone thought the relationship was on better footing. And then we had the Chinese balloon incident, which derailed it pretty quickly. That risk still exists. We could have some event. It doesn't have to be a balloon, but it could be some accident in the South China Sea or something else, an exit ban of an American. Who knows? The risk is high. I think there are also risks, of course. Department of Defense was out recently talking about, the intelligence that they have, citing over 200 cases of risky maneuvers by PLA operators. There seems to be a shift in the posture of the PLA in the South China Sea. and other areas in the Asia Pacific. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think the risk there is one that could set the relationship back in big ways. And then, of course, the other two potential risks are the results of the Taiwan election, January 13th, and how China reacts. In particular, if a DPP candidate wins. There have been some developments recently, obviously, that puts that at question. But nevertheless, that is a risk. And then, of course, the big one is the upcoming presidential election. And that will create a dynamic in which Biden and other candidates will use rhetoric on China that will be perceived in Beijing to be undermining the positive momentum coming out of this meeting and the current state of the relationship. And that, of course, creates some risks as well.
Paul, can you say another word about that last point? Because I think we say it a lot, but I'm kind of trying to figure out what that's going to look like. So at the moment, Biden is doing things vis-a-vis China that the Republicans are saying makes him weak on China. Is there going to be some moment in time in the coming months where the election fraughtness means that Biden will no longer do those things because or is he pricing it in now? Like what exactly is the dynamic leading into November 2024 that creates a potential exogenous shock again to the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I think you're right in terms of the Chinese leadership does understand the noise that comes out of a presidential election campaign. And so to a certain extent, they're inoculated to it. But I do think that the level of rhetoric and the kind of rhetoric that we could hear in 2024 may be different than in previous presidential campaigns. And President Biden, as we saw at the end of that press conference, he's already got he's walking out of that press conference and he's already thinking about, what have I said and how does that position me in terms of the domestic political situation and the campaign, which is about to intensify. And he gets asked the question, is she still a dictator? Do you still think she's a dictator? And he says, yes, I still think he is. Secretary of State Blinken winced, right? Because in a foreign policy context, in the U.S.-China relationship, that's not particularly helpful. But of course, Biden has to think about domestic politics too. And he's thinking about, what do I need to do to position myself? And in that context, it's also important to sort of, note what Biden did not say for the sake, I think, of the relationship and the progress that the two made at the meeting. The first question he got by a reporter was by Dmitry Stavropoulos from the Financial Times. And he asked him, given the situation not only in Ukraine, but now in the Middle East now, does that, change your commitment that if Chinese were to take a military move toward Taiwan, that the U.S. would be there to defend Taiwan? He could have answered it by saying, if Xi Jinping decides to attack Taiwan, the U.S., we will defend Taiwan. The way he responded was, I told President Xi we remain committed to the one China policy. And so he chose in that particular case to answer it in a way I think that was conducive to the U.S.-China relationship. In 2024, when he gets asked that question, we probably won't hear the same response. So I think it's really more about the rhetoric and the tone of the campaign, in particular around the China issue. And I think the Republicans are poised to go after Biden, especially after this meeting, which does have some positive optics around it. And they will see as ripe for criticism that the Biden administration is being too accommodating, too friendly to China, who is our number one rival in the current geopolitical environment.
Paul, you very nicely answered the follow-up question I was going to pose to you, which is what is higher on the rhetorical scale than calling Xi Jinping a dictator that Biden didn't do now but might do later? And you answered that very well. It could be something more aggressive about Taiwan. I also wanted to compliment you as someone myself who has a very hard last name to pronounce. You just nailed the pronunciation of Dimi's last name, so that was very impressive.
Well, he's been a friend. He's been a friend for over 25 years since we were in grad school together.
Oh,
so
good. So you had practice.
If I don't get his name right, I'll owe him a few beers.
Oh, very good. Okay, so let me go to Yahweh now, and Yahweh again. You can respond to things you've heard in the conversation, but I do want to move us forward to what is the future in the next few months, year going to look like, and what metrics are you looking for? What kind of external shocks are you worried about? The floor is yours, Yahweh.
Yeah, I think in the meeting, President Xi told President Biden, if you don't support Taiwan independence, you need to translate them into concrete actions. We're going to unify. So talking about Taiwan, Zoe and others talk about the economy. Paul talked about other issues. I think Taiwan probably also plays a factor here. We all know that he wants to resolve the Taiwan issue during his tenure, but he's probably very clear in his mind that at this moment, attempted military takeover of Taiwan is probably not going to happen. But if U.S. pushes too hard, then he may have to react to that. So that's one comment. He wants to dial down sort of this growing confrontation, not just in the South China Sea, but particularly in the Taiwan Strait. The second issue I want to say is, President Xi actually can help Biden to deflect the attack that he's weak on China. So I know this, in the readout of the Bali meeting, the China side still talk about the Russian invasion. There's a history, there's other things that you have to look at. So in the new readout of this San Francisco meeting, there's no mention of that. And of course, there's no mention of China's position on the Hamas attack on Israel, although Foreign Minister Wang Yi has repeatedly said Israel has the right to engage in self-defense. I think what we're going to see if this meeting does have any deliverables, concrete deliverables, is if China is going to rein in its rhetoric on Russia and even put pressure on Russia. And also if China is going to pressure Iran, not publicly, but in private. It doesn't matter whether China is going to do it publicly or privately. I guess US side will find out. And on all the other issues, for example, the military to military exchange, we don't want to hear from Admiral Aquilino saying each and every time I try to talk to the commander in China's Eastern Theater or Southern Theater, no one is going to answer my call. So, if his call is going to be answered, then that's an improvement. So I think the card really is about what's going to happen next. And then we can just sort of put all of this on a map, and then we're going to try to verify if this meeting does make any difference.
Yeah, I'm really glad you put Israel-Palestine on the agenda for this conversation because, one thing I think is very interesting to just note is that I think at least half of the questions at the Biden press conference had nothing to do with China. They were all about Israel and Palestine, which I think says something about which issue is maybe more at the top of people's minds right now. And you may want to say something about that too, but the question that I really want to pose to you is, does the conflict in the Middle East offer some kind of opportunity for the U.S. and China to, develop a new dynamic when it comes to these types of things going on in the world? The Ukraine conflict, was deeply affected, obviously, by the fact that right before the invasion, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping had this meeting, and there's this language of no limits partnership. But that's not the case when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And it does seem like China is more or less kind of doing what the U.S. wants it to do. Obviously, not everything the U.S. wants to do, but is more or less kind of responsive to the things that the U.S. wants. I think maybe others will disagree with that. But maybe the very specific question at the end of all of that is to say, do you think the situation in the Middle East does offer more of an opportunity or another type of threat to the U.S.-China relationship?
No, I think it offers a good opportunity, a big opportunity for China to offer support. So of course, we don't know exactly what U.S. want. From Jake Sullivan, he seems to suggest that China can quietly pressure Iran not to, cause this Israeli-Hamas war, to ripple to other parts of the Middle East. That's something China can do, and we'll just have to see the working team on both sides, if they're going to deal with all these issues. I think, the regional conflict and to maintain stability and mediate peace is something U.S. and China can always work together. And one last comment, I think at least this meeting has demonstrated that finally China can say, we are capable of compartmentalizing things. Because before, the Chinese approach to America is, if you don't do this, then we're not going to stop fentanyl from coming to America. U.S. has not lifted any of the sanctions. The entity list is becoming longer and longer, but China has agreed, to work with the U.S. to stop narcotic trafficking. So, if China has learned that they can do it, if they can do more, I think confidence can be built up, and that will be a very good start.
So back to you, Robert. You in your initial intervention, I think staked out the most, I think, skeptical position of the group here on what is really the reality of what China is going to do differently going forward. And so just looking at the kinds of examples that Yahweh just talked about, are those things that you think do seem that they could really put some, substance on this narrative of China being more friendly or accommodating of late? Or do you have the same level of skepticism with respect to those specific issues, including the conflict in the Middle East, including the stopping the flow of fentanyl and other things?
So a skeptical note and then a hopeful note based on what both Paul and Yahweh have said, because I think they both make some vital points. Yes, perhaps there is an opportunity in the Middle East to have China play a positive role. We should certainly explore that. At the same time, there are important aspects of China's rhetoric and its agenda to build, world orders, world systems that they have not backed off on. I mean, we should note that the Chinese public narrative about Ukraine is that it's the United States' fault. The narrative about the Middle East is that it is again the United States' fault. This is an inevitable result of American hegemony, and the Chinese telling of the Middle East story does not begin with the terrorist attacks on October 7th. It begins with American aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean steaming toward Gaza. The increased friction between China and the Philippines, again, it's the United States' fault. And in these narratives and with Ukraine and the Middle East, I think China sees itself making progress particularly in the global South, and getting closer to standing up systems and, if not alliances, at least groups of like-minded countries that can work against what we see as the United States' interests. This is one of the areas in which I think China sees itself making progress recently. The news domestically and in some ways diplomatically has been mostly negative for China, but this is a positive. So a skeptical note. I hope that Yahweh's optimism is well placed. But Paul and Yahweh also point to what could be a sea change, and if they're right, would be extremely positive in U.S.-China relations. Is China now accepting that this is fundamentally a competitive relationship, even though Xi Jinping won't say it? Of course, China has known this for a very long time. They may well have known it before we did. We have seen over the past a few years, Chinese scholars going from pushing the Beijing line of win-win, mutual respect, no confrontation, to admitting increasingly publicly that of course this is a competitive and even a rivalrous relationship. There are even major Chinese scholars who say in public fora and in the media that this is a Cold War, and that language isn't tamped down. So if China is in fact accepting, even if Xi Jinping cannot say that it's a competitive relationship, that brings a welcome, very badly needed dose of reality to our discourse and our interactions with each other. So that could indeed be very positive. And if on that foundation, if Yahweh is right, that China now has learned that it can have a highly competitive, rivalrous relationship and still compartmentalize issues, not link everything and make progress in other areas, then we could be on a really new footing. Again, the trajectory of the relationship remains negative, but we may be at a place where that can be dealt with more maturely and more openly. That would be a terrific thing. So in listening to Paul and Yahweh, I think that they may be right, and that could be the important, sort of gradual. I don't know if it's a sea change, but it's an improvement that could make all of our interactions a little bit more coherent. And then your question, you didn't ask me, but you asked others about what to look for next. One of the things I'll be looking for is if we see this increase in flights, who gets on those planes? How big is the demand really? Are we going to see American tourists, American students in large numbers? We're going to see American business people. I suspect not, but maybe I'm wrong. I think we'll have more and cheaper flights for Americans and Chinese Americans who want to go back to China to see relatives. I hope so. I want to go back and see my relatives at a reasonable rate. But I think that will be an interesting demand signal to see why people are going back to China. I think it'll probably mostly be families and not the people-to-people stuff. But let's keep an eye on that.
Well, that's very good, because it is sort of feeds into your framework that is also what the Biden administration is putting forward of something that would be a rivalrous relationship with guardrails. And I just want to see if you can put a little more specificity to what that looks like, because I myself am not entirely, I've been trying to think of analogies to what we are trying to propose here, and one of the things that came to my mind was like, is this Yankees Red Sox? Is it Lakers Celtics, right? Is it like deep, deep, deep competition? And you don't want to be in the Boston Stadium wearing a Derek Jeter jersey, but at the same time, the city of New York is probably not going to drop a nuclear bomb on the city of Boston. Is that what we're talking about? Or like what is the real world thing we've seen that gives us an understanding of what deeply rivalrous relationship, but still we're talking from time to time, looks like?
Right. It's funny that I was also thinking about baseball analogies while we were speaking and trying to figure out what this was. And it's not that, the Red Sox want to bomb Yankee Stadium. On the other hand, it's not simply a competition between the Red Sox and the Yankees in which they play by the rules. In this case, the Red Sox want to see the Yankees relegated to Double-A, to the minor leagues. They want they're competing, but they want the Yankees to cease to be a competitor in the full sense. I think it might be a better way of looking at that. But maybe I'm stretching the analogy
but
a
if
little bit too far.
if that's what you want, like, I mean, if that's what you want, I don't entirely understand how you can also be like, oh, but let's also work on these other issues together.
Well,
like,
we want to work on the other.
I understand why the Chinese are a little skeptical of that.
Sure. Oh, I think that both sides' skepticism are very easy to understand. There's no big mystery here, and the basic Chinese human instinct that no, you cannot pat me on the back and sucker punch me in the ribs at the same time. I'm not going to put up with that. That's always been easy to understand. It just doesn't accord very well with the needs of major powers in a complex world that actually do have to do both of those things at the same time. And that's why I'm hopeful that if Yahweh and Paul are both right, that we are in a more mature place where China has a little more stomach for the nastier parts of the competition, although it's perfectly easy to understand why they don't like it. I think that for the Biden administration, and they haven't quite shouted this from the rooftops, but it's been in their rhetoric recently. When they speak of stabilizing this relationship, they mean that they want to continue to prosecute the same China policy, which includes things like export controls, but they don't want to increase the risk of conflict. In other words, the goal of policy is not to go to war, right? And that's what stabilization means for Biden. You just used the dreaded guardrails analogy again. And I think that, China's initial critique of guardrails, which is, no, you slow down and you don't need guardrails. Actually, that was a legitimate comeback on China's point. And the same critique could be made of Biden's switch to stabilization instead of guardrails. But stability is an important word in the Chinese political lexicon, so they're okay with that. So when we speak of stabilizing the relationship, it's about avoiding conflict, but not lightening up on China. When China speaks of stabilization in the relationship, what I think they mean is they want us to back off. They want us to cease the unrelenting insults, attacks that they've heard from us. In other words, when they say stabilization, they mean they want us to stop prosecuting this China policy that we want to prosecute under the rubric of stabilization. So if that's right, we've got a lurking problem because we're using the same word in a very different way.
Paul, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to weigh in on this point?
I do, partly because I have to jump now for another meeting, but also this is a great conversation. I just wanted to weigh in on this one question before I drop out. What if the Chinese have kind of come around that they can engage with us, they can find areas of cooperation, even if the U.S. is still going to describe this as a strategic competition and push back on China on a range of issues that it deems is undermining U.S. interest? It's an open question. I agree with Robert. I think the Chinese side is aiming for something different than what the U.S. is proposing. But these are important shifts, and we should pay attention to what they are. What does that mean? How would that look? What is this new framework? It's terra incognita, as you sort of suggest, right? I think we remember last year when Biden and Xi met in Bali, they agreed to discuss principles and operating mechanisms for managing a relationship where the list of differences and disagreements continues to grow, yet the two countries need to get along. Dan Crittenbrink, Assistant Secretary, and then the Vice Foreign Minister, Xie Feng, the now ambassador, met in Langfang, just south of Beijing, to begin this conversation about principles to kind of manage the relationship. There's a lot of skepticism about this for the reasons that Robert mentioned, which is that many U.S. officials and observers think that when the U.S. side says principles and operating mechanisms to manage the relationship, they mean something very different than what the Chinese are trying to achieve. And when you raise this question about principles, often you hear from Chinese scholars, yes, we need the U.S., as Robert says, to back off. We need the U.S. to respect our core interests on Taiwan and other issues, even where there have been differences of positions for many, many decades. And that's not realistic, and it's not going to happen. But I do think that the answer is in finding some way and a set of principles, operating mechanisms, agreements, understandings, where despite the growing differences, despite the competition in the relationship, which is, I agree with Robert, the Chinese have known the strategic competition in this relationship probably longer than we have, and they push back on us, in similar ways that we've pushed back on them. So they, in practical terms, they do what we're talking about, but they don't want to say it. But the question is, can the two sides begin that process again? I think it'll be slow. It'll take time. But most criticism of the U.S. policy on China is there's no description of where the end point is. And I think that sort of begins to set out where a possible end point could be if what everyone is saying on this call is true, which is that the long-term trends are toward greater competition and growing rivalry.
Great, Paul. And thanks again for joining today. If you do need to drop off in a bit, I am really appreciative you joined. I do want to get Anna and Zoe in, and I see Jeff Wasserstrom has raised his hand, so I'm going to try to bring him up on stage as well. But Anna, lots on the table here that you may want to speak to, but I do also want to hear you on, what are we looking for in the next period until the next sort of difficult event happens that makes things complicated again?
Yeah, I mean, so much that could be independent, long conversations, and the many great comments that have been made. I guess I would start with I loved the Red Sox versus Yankees analogy, and clearly, the U.S. is the Yankees here seeking to relegate China to AA, and China knows that. And I don't actually think that China doesn't have the maturity to understand that this kind of relationship will involve both backpats and sucker punches. I think China conducts that kind of relationship with other players around the world. I think it understands that. The problem is, it anticipates and knows to expect the sucker punches. It is less certain that it's going to get the backpats. And I think that's because, while China has some sense of what it needs from the US, where it could benefit from engagement with the US, where its economy would be better off because of engagement with the US. It is not necessarily as clear that the US has a unified understanding of what it affirmatively needs from China. Does it need more market access? Does it need cooperation on geopolitical crises? Does it need cooperation on things like climate change? And if the US has an idea of what it needs or what it wants from China that China can affirmatively give, what's it willing to do in order to establish that cooperation? And will there be a consistent understanding of the US needs vis-a-vis China that weathers the presidential election and is still there if another person assumes the executive office? And I think those are all completely fair uncertainties for China to have right now, because it's the US that really initiated this major strategic rethink. I mean, you can certainly argue that China was doing all of these things that may have precipitated it, and I don't disagree. China was pursuing its self-interest in ways that were too self-serving and problematic for the United States, and still is, and is going to continue to do so, especially if it thinks that it's not likely to get much out of the US. But the US needs to answer those questions for itself, and I don't think that we're quite there yet. I think maybe the Biden administration has more of a vision of some of the affirmative things that the relationship that are possible in the relationship, but I don't think that is a unified vision in Washington at all. In terms of what might happen next, that would be good signs. Yeah,
and Anna, just before you say that, because what you said was so interesting, I just want to put one sort of thought on the table and then have you go into the next steps thing.
Sure.
I have to say, I think you set it up as, would you rather have both sides just fully acknowledging we're in a rivalrous relationship? Is that healthier? Or would you rather have both sides suggest we're in a cooperative relationship, but then do rivalrous stuff behind the scenes? Which is better? Is it better for it to be explicit that we're rivalrous, or have it be more subtext? And I think you were arguing that the Chinese generally want it to be subtext, that they think let's have happy talk on the surface and subtext be, we're doing all these shivving each other in the back to get ahead. I don't know that you necessarily think this, but what I started to think was, is it actually better if we say it that we are? Because once you say that we're like fully, everyone knows we're going to be shivving each other in the back, there's like nothing to like build trust in that kind of context. And I think that's one of the things that I personally have been very worried about, is there's no trust between the two sides. So is it a trust build? Maybe that's my question to you. Is it a trust building exercise to take the subtext of rivalrous behavior and make it text, or does it just hurt the trust building exercise even more?
That's a really interesting framing. That's not exactly what I was saying, but I like it. I think it's a good question to ponder and discuss, which needs to be the main text and which needs to be the subtext, where there's rivalry, but also some degree of cooperation that could benefit both sides. And I do agree that China, very strongly feels that framing the entire relationship as rivalry, as competition, does not facilitate cooperation at all. It undermines it. Whereas I think on the U.S. side, the Biden administration is saying, well, it can be a strategic competition, a competition that is healthy for both sides. But there's not a whole lot of talk about cooperation. It's very limited. And there's this idea that cooperation is going to exist within a framework of that is fundamentally one of competition. And then there's the Hill that the hawkish voices on the Hill deny the idea of any cooperation at all, as like something that if the U.S. were to go down that road, it would be not a demonstrable moral failing. It would be foolish and stupid and being taken in by China's duplicity. So I think China's looking at that, and just of course there's a trust deficit, because who to listen to from Washington. Biden may be the ultimate decision maker right now, but that very well could change. And when it changes, what does that mean? What should they expect? How do they plan for it? And how do they build trust in a climate where, less than a year from now, they could be facing, a completely different reality, one that they are not even sure what to expect. Like even if they're assuming that, the different reality is that Trump becomes president again, there's still huge questions about exactly what it would mean in the U.S.-China context to have a second Trump administration. I don't think anybody really knows. In terms of what to expect next, I think Robert made a good point that probably, at least at the outset, we're not going to be seeing planes full of tourists or students, and maybe not planes full of business people, although I think the business people are starting to trickle back. Yes, there is anxiety about exactly how things are on the ground, and there's anxiety about the incidents that have been reported of exit bans or detentions or raids. There's also, the reality that the economy isn't doing super great, and there are real questions around exactly what the business opportunities are, and whether or not there should be exploration of alternative opportunities elsewhere. There are regulatory ambiguities and compliance challenges that businesses are facing, and there are things there the Chinese side can address, should address, has every reason to know it needs to address. But there are also, really are, I think, potential opportunities for the business relationship, assuming that the U.S. government continues to allow a business relationship. One thing that I picked up while I was having conversations and meetings in China this last couple of weeks was the idea that, everybody talks about infrastructure projects having sort of run their course in China, but what about soft infrastructure projects, which was essentially a reference to building a social safety net, creating, the elder care and healthcare facilities that are needed to improve the quality of care in China, and to address, the burdens on younger people entering the workforce who have more older people to take care of than the other way around. There's lots of room for stuff like that in China, and it's the kind of thing that China can't just itself initiate a huge stimulus to accomplish right now. It actually really needs foreign investment to get it done because of the economic constraints that Zoe was mentioning. And those are things that there happen to be really expert, robust U.S. industries that could provide a lot of service and also help to build up China's own market to serve its own people. So perhaps those opportunities will get some room to unfold. And if they do, I think that's a positive for the overall relationship, because kind of regardless of the ideological differences, there are realities about how our economies are intertwined, about the kind of national security threat that we could pose to each other if we get too focused on our differences and not on our common interests. And I think it's important for us to try to identify the common interests and pursue them where we can.
Great, Anna. I want to go to Zoe next, and then I'm really happy that Jeff Wasserstrom is not only in the audience, but wants to come up on stage. So then there's a very specific thing I actually want to ask Jeff to speak to, and then we'll sort of wrap up after that. So let me bring Jeff up on stage, but first go to Zoe to really to speak to this question of what are you looking for in the next period, but also you can respond to things that have come up in the last round of comments as well.
In the immediate term, I would look for specifically for two things. The first one is how the cooperation on counter narcotics, and in particular fentanyl and fentanyl precursors, how this is going to be enforced in term, because I am, so the reason I mentioned that I'm going to follow this is because, especially in the medium term, is because this is not necessarily the top priority for President Xi Jinping, but it is for President Biden, especially for domestic audiences here. But it is not necessarily going to be easy for China to execute this. Part of the reason is because this is a hugely profitable market, and then the second reason is because, well, this is the market, the chemicals and pharmaceutical market in China is highly fragmented. And then thirdly, how are you going to identify what kind of substances or chemicals and being produced by what type of factories? Is it a food additives maker, or is it, just a medical company? So how are you going to enforce this kind of agreement on counter narcotics, especially knowing that China has already put a class-wide ban on fentanyl and fentanyl substances back in 2019. So that I'm going to follow closely, because if there is going to be any deliverables, that should be one, but it's highly challenging. And then secondly, I also wanted to follow, I will also follow the US-China climate cooperation, because when I look at comparing how China and US sources report and summarize the readout of the cooperation, the summit, I think China, before the meeting, in Qiushi, the party flag magazine, they talked about the Yangguang Zhixiang Corporation, the Sunny Village, Sunny Valley statement. And then after the meeting, I think the Ministry of Ecology also mentioned environmental ecology, put out another statement with regard to US-China joint statement on fighting climate crisis and all that. And here they specifically talked about, I remember there are a lot of things, but they specifically talked about both sides will restart bilateral energy policy strategic dialogue. And if that is an additional channel of dialogue, I think that's great, especially because, we are doing a lot of industrial policies, and in China, or there are already excess capacities. So from that perspective, I'm really worried if there were economic downturn in both countries, and knowing that China has a lot of excess capacity, how is this going to play out for the trade relationship? And then finally, in terms of what worries me as exogenous shocks, my colleagues already made a lot of great, brilliant point there. I don't have anything to add in terms of the state level activities, but I do worry some exogenous shocks implemented or identified by some non-state actors, such as a cyber attack. If somebody identified or reported or disclosed a cyber attack by some Chinese entities, then it begs the question: is it PLA? Is it state sponsored? And that worries me. That's all.
Great, Zoe. I was really excited to have Jeff up on stage, but I think we've lost him. I see him in the audience. I'll try to bring him back up to speak, because I did want to ask him a very particular question, but if that doesn't work, we can start to kind of wrap this up. I covered a lot in this conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you and to Paul for spending this time with me and with this audience, sort of poking these issues from every side. Let me maybe just see a quick round robin if I can't get Jeff up here. Is there anything that anyone up on stage feels like they just want to add at the very end here before we close today's discussion and look forward to our next one? I'll see Robert first.
I I think it's been a great discussion, expertly moderated as always, Nathan. Really appreciate it. No, I think we've covered most of it. As I said at the outset, I'm still not optimistic about the trajectory of the relationship, although I'm very glad this meeting took place. As in Bali, I see no sign that either Biden or Xi Jinping is rethinking his positions at all. No sign that they are reconsidering interests, goals, or strategies. No sign that either leader has reassessed the other, has reassessed, his own positions, or has reassessed the roles that both countries might play or might seek to play in the world. So a slight increase in positives coming out of the summit. That's a good thing. I don't see any decline in the negative factors and the suspicion and the genuine rivalry that has driven us to this point.
Great, Robert. And I did manage to convince Jeff to come up back on stage. So Jeff, I know that you might be walking, and I just want to put one very specific thing to you, because it hasn't come up in the conversation so far, which is, where does the discussion about the human rights situation in China, the situation in Hong Kong, the situation with the Uyghurs, just general human rights concerns within mainland China, where does that fit into the overall landscape of this current moment in U.S.-China relations that we've been discussing in this last hour and a half?
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question, was that why I didn't hear the word Hong Kong mentioned at all. I didn't hear the mention of Xinjiang, that presumably these got brought up in passing, but it's been very, very low key. I also thought, I wanted to mention something about there are a couple of things about optics and about symbolism and even about terminology. When we think about whether Xi Jinping, whether to call him a dictator or not, calling him a president makes continually, rather than general secretary of the Communist Party or rather than, paramount leader, makes it seem there's more of a parallel between their situations, the situation of Xi and Biden. Anna made a very good point about the uncertainty of knowing who will be in the White House going forward. But in dealing with China, the uncertainty is whether anybody other than Xi is capable of making agreements that will last, when there's been such shifts in the top leadership recently. And this is different. I think it's worth continually reminding us of how different some of these things are from earlier periods. And so I think that's something that, in a way, it sort of forces you into this question of, well, let's remember that he's not the same kind of leader of a state. And also, in terms of the dinner, is whether you'll be in the same room with a leader is one thing, but there was apparently a standing ovation for Xi Jinping. And that's the part where the human rights issue, to me, would just be so hard to get around. It's one thing to say you want to hear what somebody has to say to American businessmen when there's an important business people, when there's an important kind of relationship. It's another thing to have a standing ovation for somebody who's complicit in these kinds of human rights abuses and the grotesque human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the strangling of Hong Kong, the ongoing situation in Tibet. So I think those are things that are, sometimes they aren't just kind of either or questions. It's not a question of whether there should be a forum for Xi Jinping to speak to other Americans who want to hear him, but the standing ovation and the kind of symbolic respect shown in that way does seem to me problematic.
So, Jeff, all of those are well taken, but I want to push you on one particular thing, because I think, certainly Robert and others in the call have suggested that the U.S. is trying to accept that we are in a deeply rivalrous relationship, and we just make that subtext the text, and we know that we're both sides. We're going to be doing everything we can to keep the other side down. But there's a few things that we can reach some consensus on to keep us from nuking each other, right? If that's what we are trying to get, that's what the U.S. is trying to get, where does human rights fit into that? How does that, you could say to the Chinese, look, we're going to be kind of doing everything we can to keep you down, but let's at least not destroy the environment. And then you say, but also we want to tell you something about the way you're, dealing with human rights internally. Isn't that plausible? The Chinese would be look, if you were in a deeply rivalrous relationship, don't talk to us about human rights. That's really not part of this deal. Is that not a plausible thing the Chinese could say if we are setting up the framework of deeply rivalrous relationship?
But there's also just how much of it comes into the symbolism or the statements outside of this that go along with the other things with APEC as well. There's also a fundamental irony. I was thinking about this, that it was at an APEC meeting back in 2001. Sorry to play the historian, but it was at an APEC meeting in 2001 that actually the Chinese side wanted to bring up Xinjiang because it was at the war. It was at the beginning of the war on terror, and one of the things that that Jiang Zemin wanted to get out of the meeting with George W. Bush at APEC was to place a group of Uyghurs in the same kind of category. So there are ways in which I don't think these issues are not always as separable as I think you just presented them as being. Yes, they can be different things, but I think you could also say Hong Kong is not irrelevant to this because Hong Kong is a question of whether the Chinese Communist Party does or doesn't keep the deals that it makes with international bodies, or it makes the kinds of contractual arrangements it makes. If you wanted to bring up the Hong Kong situation, not so much purely on human rights, but as a kind of changing the way in which the one country, two systems was dealt with. So I think there are ways that those things could be brought up, or could have been more in the discussion of this APEC meeting. However, they were dealt with in the behind closed doors session with Biden and Xi. I just think it behooves us to keep them as part of the discourse about this relationship.
And you and me had a chance to see each other yesterday in Irvine, and we can obviously, just the two of us could keep going for a long, long time. So we will take our exchange on this offline. I do want to bring the conversation to a close. I think I'm just going to give Yahweh a last word here to help us kind of like see, where does all of this kind of point to for the next window before us, before the next time we have this kind of conversation with a group like this.
Yeah, if there is such a thing called the San Francisco consensus, that's what it's been referred to in the Chinese media. I think Biden probably is more vulnerable because many players in the U.S. Can derail, and of course there is the presidential election just around the corner. If you listen to the Republican candidate debate, China last Wednesday was literally tried and convicted and sentenced to death. So there is more certainty on the China side, whether Xi is serious, in his conversation with Biden, and also what he said in his speech. Then our eyes are wide open. We're going to see how under his leadership or control or pressure, China is going to implement all the things he said he's going to do. Secondly, I think, he did mention 5 pillars in his meeting with President Biden. If you look at the 5 pillars, I think it does help us to have a better sort of understanding, how this relationship is going to be sustained. The first one is manage the perceptions of each other. Second, crisis management. Third, where can we cooperate? And third, where both big powers can we responsibly manage our own business and also regional businesses? And lastly, people to people. So I guess, next time we have the discussion, we can evaluate the relationship from these 5 pillars. Lastly, what I want to say is, we talk about the U.S. goal is probably to avoid war, and Taiwan election is just around the corner. How China is going to respond to the election process before election, and how China is going to respond if William Lai is elected, and how U.S. is going to manage, and if both sides can manage this relationship responsibly, then I think if they can control the Taiwan situation so that U.S. and China do not veer into conflict, that would be something I think that we can say at least the San Francisco meeting has accomplished that.